The trauma bay at Hargrove Naval Medical Center had seen its share of bad nights. Shattered bones, severed arteries, men brought in from places the military never officially acknowledged. But nothing, not in 11 years of operating, had ever stopped every person in that room the way it happened on a Tuesday in October, when a dying Navy SEAL commander ripped the oxygen mask from his face, grabbed the nearest orderly by the collar, and screamed a name that meant nothing to anyone in that building, except the quiet blonde nurse standing in the far corner who had gone very, very still. Her name was Ellie Marsh. To the staff of Hargrove's trauma unit, she was background noise, competent enough to keep around, invisible enough to ignore. She charted meds, changed dressings, assisted in procedures when the doctors remembered she existed. She never raised her voice. She never pushed back. She absorbed Dr. Raymond Stoll's daily contempt with the practiced patience of someone who had learned, a long time ago, how to make herself small. Nobody at Hargrove Naval Medical Center in Port Salinger, Virginia, knew what Ellie Marsh had been before she walked through their doors 4 years ago. They hadn't asked. She hadn't told them. The commander kept screaming. It had started like any other trauma call. The radio crackle came at 11:47 p.m., multiple casualty vehicle incident outside the base perimeter, 4 personnel en route, 1 critical. Ellie had been in the middle of restocking a supply cart when the alert fired through the overhead speakers. She capped her pen, set down her clipboard, and followed the current of moving bodies toward the bay. Dr. Raymond Stoll was already gowned when she arrived. He had that particular expression he wore during serious cases, jaw set, chin slightly elevated, the look of a man preparing to be witnessed doing something important. He was a capable surgeon. He was also the kind of man who needed every room to know it. Marsh. He didn't look up from where he was snapping on his second glove. You can handle triage overflow in Bay 3. Dr. Stoll, I'm already assigned to Bay 3. He turned just enough to make eye contact, just enough to make it a correction rather than a conversation. We've got a critical incoming. I need people who can handle pressure without freezing. Someone behind her, one of the younger residents, she didn't see who, coughed into their fist. Ellie nodded and started to turn. That was when the bay doors blew open. 4 men in tactical gear, 2 of them walking, 1 being half carried, 1 strapped to a gurney moving fast. Military police flanked them on both sides. The man on the girder was the one in the worst shape, chest armor already cut away, field dressing soaked through, a tourniquet on his right thigh that looked like it had been applied by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. But he was conscious. That was the part that caught Ellie's attention. His eyes were open, darting, taking in the room with the hyper-alert focus of someone still partially running on adrenaline. His lips were moving. One of the paramedics had already replaced his field mask with an oxygen unit, but he kept trying to pull it away, and the paramedic kept gently pressing it back. The gurney hit the center of the trauma bay. Stoll stepped forward. The commander pulled the mask off. "Phoenix!" The word came out ragged, hoarse, but loud enough to bounce off every wall. "I want Operator Phoenix, now. Somebody get me." He coughed, hard, the kind of cough that rattled from somewhere deep. One of the monitors they'd already attached began its high-pitched warning. "Get Phoenix, she's here. I know she's here." Base record said, "Sir, I need you to keep the mask." "Where is she?" He grabbed the paramedic's wrist. His grip, even depleted, left white marks. "Phoenix, is she—" The room had gone quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something unexpected has crossed a line from strange into significant. Not the quiet of a single paused breath, but the quiet of 15 people simultaneously recalibrating. Stoll moved to the head of the gurney. "Sir, I'm Dr. Raymond Stoll, Chief of Trauma Surgery. You're at Hargrove Naval Medical Center. You're in good hands. We need you to stay calm and keep the oxygen. I don't want—" Another cough. The monitor screamed louder. "I need Phoenix. She's a nurse. She's assigned here. I saw the transfer records. Someone tell me she's in this building." In the far corner of the trauma bay, beside the supply cart she'd been restocking 40 seconds ago, Ellie Marsh had not moved. She was watching the commander's face. She was watching the color of his lips, the way his neck muscles were working, the specific quality of distress in his breathing. She was watching all of it with the calm, flat attention of someone running a fast calculation behind still eyes. She already knew what was wrong with him. She just hadn't decided yet what she was going to do about it. Raymond Stoll did not like the word Phoenix, not because it meant anything to him. It didn't, not yet, but because it had redirected the attention in his trauma bay to a word that wasn't his name, and he had built his entire professional identity on being the most important noun in any room he entered. Sir, he kept his voice measured, authoritative, the tone he used with difficult patience. No one by that designation works at this facility. You've sustained significant trauma. I need to ask you to cooperate so we can— She's here! The commander's voice had dropped, less shouting now, something more desperate underneath it. Her name is on the transfer manifest. She came from Langley Naval 3 years ago. I had my CO verify it last week. He turned his head, scanning the room. His gaze moved past the residents, past the nurses clustered near the monitoring station, past Stoll himself, and stopped. Ellie didn't flinch. She held the eye contact. Something crossed the commander's face, recognition, relief, and something that looked almost like a man who had been holding his breath for a very long time, finally exhaling. Phoenix, he said, quietly this time. Not a demand, a name. Every head in the trauma bay turned toward Ellie Marsh. Stoll turned last. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, with the particular expression of a man who has decided, at some earlier point, that a person is not worth the full resolution of his attention. Marsh. His voice had an edge in it now, something tighter than his usual condescension. Do you know this patient? I know of his unit, she said carefully. I don't know him personally. Then I'm not sure why he's calling your name. Neither am I, sir. It was a lie, or at least it was not the full truth. She hadn't seen the man's face before tonight, but she knew the call sign he was shouting because it had been hers. And she knew that the only people who should have had access to the transfer records he mentioned were operating at a clearance level that no one in this hospital, including Stoll, could touch. She also knew that the commander's breathing had changed in the last 90 seconds in a way that had nothing to do with pain. Stoll held her gaze for a moment that lasted slightly too long, then turned back to the gurney. Get me a full panel. I want imaging on the chest and abdomen, and get him sedated. He's going to blow his own blood pressure fighting us. Wait. Ellie took a half step forward before she could stop herself. Stoll paused. He did not turn around. Did you just— His JVD, she said. Look at his neck veins, and his pressure's been dropping since he came through the door. That's not from the leg wound. The field tourniquet controlled the hemorrhage. Something else is— Marsh. He said her name the way you'd say stop to a dog that was getting into the trash. Flat, dismissive. I see the same monitors you see. His pressure's low because he's been bleeding for 40 minutes. Now I asked you to go to Bay 3. He has cardiac tamponade. The words landed like something dropped from a height. One of the residents, a second-year named Fortuna, who Ellie had privately decided was going to be excellent someday, looked up from the IV line he was establishing. Stoll turned around slowly. He had a way of moving when he was angry that compressed itself, like heat before a storm. I'm sorry? The pattern is consistent. She kept her voice level. She had learned in a previous life that the less emotion you brought to a technical argument, the more people heard the technical part. Hypotension, distended neck veins, the quality of his breathing, it's not matching simple hemorrhagic shock. If there's fluid compressing the pericardium, there is no fluid compressing the pericardium. Stoll's voice was slow, deliberate, the kind of slow that isn't patience, it's dominance. Because I haven't seen the imaging yet, which means neither have you, which means this is speculation, which means you are in a critical trauma bay, in the middle of an active resuscitation, offering unsolicited differential diagnoses about a condition you haven't confirmed and I haven't asked you about. He paused. Go to Bay 3. Nobody spoke. Ellie looked at the commander. The commander was looking at her. His lips moved. No sound came out, but she could read it. She had learned to read lips in environments where radio silence was the difference between operational success and a body bag. Please, he said. She looked back at Stoll. She went to Bay 3. Bay 3 contained a sailor with a broken wrist and a laceration above his eyebrow that needed 8 stitches. He was 23 years old and nervous in the way young people are when they've never been seriously hurt before, when the body's vulnerability has just become real to them for the first time. Ellie put him at ease without thinking about it. She had a register for this, a tone she could produce automatically that communicated you are safe, You are being taken care of. I'm not going to let anything bad happen to you while you're in my hands." And she was 12 minutes into the suturing when she heard the alarm. Not the routine alarm, not the persistent beep of a monitor needing attention. The code alarm. She was at the door of Bay 3 before she'd made a conscious decision to move. The sounds coming from the main trauma bay were specific. She cataloged them the way she cataloged everything. Fast, involuntarily, each sound filing itself into the correct category of severity and proximity before she'd had time to process any of them individually. The flatline tone on the cardiac monitor. Stoll's voice, raised but controlled, calling for defib. The elevated pitch of organized panic, not chaos but urgency, the kind that means people are working and scared at the same time. She stood in the doorway. The commander had arrested. Not fully, not flatline, but his pressure had cratered. The main monitor was showing a heart trying and failing, rate too fast, output too weak, and Stoll was at the head of the gurney with the paddles in his hands, and Resident Fortuna was doing compressions, and 3 other people were moving with the specific focused urgency of people who are managing a situation they understand. But Ellie was looking at the echo images that had just come up on the secondary monitor, the ones the imaging tech must have gotten through in the last few minutes, and she could see it. Dark rim of fluid, right there, around this pericardium, compressing the heart from the outside. Cardiac tamponade. Exactly what she'd said. She crossed the trauma bay before she decided to. "Get back." She said it to no one specifically, and everyone in general, and the particular quality of her voice, not loud, not aggressive, something beneath both of those things, something older, made 2 nurses step sideways without quite knowing why. Stoll looked up from the paddles. His face changed through several expressions in rapid succession, ending on something that looked like a man who was about to do something he hadn't done in a long time, which was lose control in a professional environment. "Marsh." His echo is on the secondary monitor. She was already at the supply cart. Her hands knew where things were. They had always known where things were in rooms like this one. 2 centimeters of pericardial effusion, at minimum. The defibrillation isn't going to work because the problem isn't the rhythm. The problem is the compression. He needs a needle in the pericardial space right now, or he's going to die in front of you in the next 90 seconds. "You don't have the authority. Do you want to argue about authority, or do you want to save him?" Stoll opened his mouth. The monitor flatlined. Not the code alarm, the actual flatline. The sound that means the conversation is over. Ellie had the spinal needle in her right hand. She was already gloved. She'd grabbed them from the cart without thinking. She moved to the left of the gurney, positioned herself, and placed her left hand flat on the commander's chest to feel the landmarks she needed. "Somebody call it," she said. "Give me a countdown." Fortuna, without hesitation, without looking at Stoll. 60 seconds, approximately, before brain. "I know." She found the angle. Her hands were steady. They had always been steady. In worse places than this, under worse conditions than this, with fewer resources than this, she had done things with her hands that she'd never fully been able to explain to anyone who hadn't been there. She inserted the needle. The room held its breath. Stoll was not moving. Nobody was moving. The needle found the pericardial space. She withdrew the plunger. Dark blood. Old, clotted, wrong blood, the blood of internal bleeding that had been trapped where it shouldn't be, pulled back into the syringe. The monitor shifted. Not flatline. A rhythm. Weak, disorganized, then steadier. The pressure numbers on the main screen began to climb, slowly, then with more confidence, like something surfacing from very deep water. The commander's chest rose. His eyes opened. He turned his head, and he found her face, and he said, with what breath he had, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Phoenix, I knew you'd come." Ellie pulled the needle back. Her hands did not shake. She looked at the monitors, read the numbers, confirmed what she was seeing, and then set the syringe down on the tray beside her and peeled off her gloves the way you do when something is finished. "He needs a thoracic surgeon," she said, to no one in particular. "The effusion is probably from a penetrating injury that the field dressing didn't catch. Someone needs to get a chest surgeon on the line." Nobody spoke. She turned. Stoll was standing exactly where he'd been, paddles still in his hands. His face had a quality she had never seen on him before, which was blankness. Not the cultivated blankness of professional composure, but the involuntary blankness of a man who has had his self-conception interrupted before he could prepare for it. Around him, the rest of the trauma team stood without speaking. Fortuna was looking at her with an expression she recognized. She had seen it before, on different faces, in different rooms, when something happened that people had not been trained to expect. She had never wanted to produce that look. She had spent 4 years at this hospital specifically trying not to produce that look. She bent and picked up the syringe from the tray to dispose of it properly. "Someone should call the chest surgeon," she said again quietly. "And someone should monitor his pressure. I want readings every 2 minutes until he's stable." She walked toward the supply disposal station. Behind her, a single monitor beeped steadily, the commander's heart, finding its rhythm, holding it. And from somewhere in the building, coming through the walls, she heard a sound she had not heard in 4 years. The sound of multiple heavy vehicles, the particular growl of reinforced military transport, pulling into a parking area designed for civilian traffic. Not one vehicle, several. Moving in the coordinated way that military vehicles move when the people inside them know where they're going and don't intend to be slowed down getting there. Ellie set the syringe down. She looked at the window. She couldn't see the parking lot from here, but she could hear them, and she could count the engine sounds, and she had spent enough of her life in proximity to that particular sound to know exactly what it meant. Somebody had made a phone call, and someone, somewhere, had answered it. What? The military police came through the front entrance first. 4 of them, in full dress, clearing the lobby, the way trained people clear a space. Not aggressive, not alarmed, just deliberate, establishing presence before anything else arrived that would need it. The hospital's overnight security desk had a single guard who took one look at the identification being presented and did not ask any follow-up questions. Then came the men in plain clothes. 3 of them. Moving with the specific quality of people who have learned to look civilian but have not quite managed to unlearn military. They went directly toward the elevator without stopping to speak to anyone. And then, through the main entrance came a man in full dress uniform who carried himself the way certain men carry themselves when the rank on their collar is not the most significant thing they bring into a room. The name on his badge said Rear Admiral Thomas Ray, Naval Special Warfare Command. He did not stop at the security desk. He walked directly toward the trauma wing. Ellie did not know any of this was happening yet. She was still standing at the supply station. She had her back to the door. But she heard the footsteps. And before the door to the trauma bay opened, before anyone said a word, before any of the machinery of consequence that had apparently been set in motion finally arrived in this room, she felt it. The specific weight in the air that she had first learned to recognize at 24 years old, in a different country, on a different continent, when a life she'd lived before this one had been very real and very loud. The feeling of something classified becoming unclassified. She did not turn around, she waited. Behind her the door opened, and the footsteps stopped, and then a man's voice, measured, formal, with the particular quality of someone delivering a statement they have prepared, said, "Is there a nurse Ellie Marsh on duty tonight?" Raymond Stoll, who had not spoken since the flatline, cleared his throat. "She's—" He paused. A pause that contained, Ellie thought, more information about Raymond Stoll's current state of mind than anything he'd said in the last 20 minutes. "She's right here." The footsteps resumed, and Ellie Marsh, who had spent 4 years becoming invisible, finally turned around. Rear Admiral Thomas Ray was not a tall man, but he had the posture of someone who had decided, at some early point, that height was optional and bearing was not. He stopped 3 feet from her. He looked at her face in the specific way of someone confirming a recognition, not forming one. "Nurse Marsh," he said. "Admiral," she said. It was the first time in 4 years that she had said that word in reference to a real person in a real room, and the sound of it in her own voice was strange, like hearing a language you'd been pretending not to know. Something moved in Ray's expression. Not warmth, exactly. Something more careful than warmth. "The commander," he said. "How is he?" "Stabilizing." She kept her voice at the same register she used for everything in this hospital. Level. Professional. The register of someone who was not the center of anything. Cardiac tamponade from a penetrating injury that wasn't caught at the field level. "I performed emergency pericardiocentesis about 6 minutes ago. He needs a thoracic team, but his rhythm is holding." "Your assessment of his prognosis?" "Good, if the surgery happens in the next couple of hours." Ray nodded. Behind him, Ellie was aware of the trauma team standing in a loose cluster that wasn't quite a crowd. She was aware of Stoll specifically, standing slightly apart from the others, still holding the paddles, which he hadn't put down, which meant some part of his brain was still processing the last 15 minutes and hadn't gotten to the part about putting things away. "I need to speak with you privately," Ray said. "I'm on duty." "I understand that." He said it without apology, without concession. "This will take a few minutes. Your department head can assign coverage." He looked past her, at Stoll. Not at Stoll's face, at Stoll's general direction, the look of a senior officer acknowledging the presence of someone significantly lower in a hierarchy that they both understood and only one of them was comfortable in. Stoll put down the paddles. Yes. Fortuna, take primary on the commander. Marsh, you can..." He stopped. Reorganized. "Marsh, go ahead." It was, Ellie thought, the first time in her tenure at Hargrove Naval Medical Center that Raymond Stoll had said, "Go ahead," to her, and meant it as anything other than sarcasm. She followed the Admiral into the corridor. They stood in the alcove near the stairwell. One of the plainclothes men took a position at the corridor entrance without being asked. The other two were somewhere else in the building. She could hear faintly the sound of conversation near the elevator, official and clipped. "The commander asked for you by call sign," Ray said. "You understand what that means. He's running a fever and he was losing blood pressure. People say things." He said it 11 times during transport. His team reported it. His CO reported it to me. "I made 3 calls before I got on the vehicle." He paused. "You understand what I'm telling you?" She understood exactly what he was telling her. "My record is sealed," she said. "Records are sealed until circumstances unseal them." He looked at her with the patience of someone who has had very uncomfortable conversations and has learned that the discomfort shortens if you move through it rather than around it. Commander Dax Heller has been trying to reach Operator Phoenix for 4 months. He hit classified blocks every time. When his team called in his transport tonight, they flagged the call sign demand and it went up the chain fast. A pause. "I need to know if you're the same person." Ellie looked at the corridor wall. The wall had a scuff mark on it, mid-height, the kind left by a gurney wheel hitting the same spot over and over. She had walked past this scuff mark approximately 300 times. She had never thought anything about it. "I'm a nurse," she said. "You performed a field-grade emergency pericardiocentesis from memory in a hospital trauma bay without imaging guidance, with a patient coding under your hands, and you did it in under 45 seconds. I've had training. The specific training you're describing takes years to develop at that level of execution." She looked back at him. "I've had a lot of years." Ray held her gaze. He had the kind of eyes that had seen things, and not recovered from them, and had made a decision to carry that rather than set it down. "3 men are attempting to access Commander Heller's recovery room right now," he said. "My people are handling it, but I need you to understand what kind of situation you're standing in the middle of tonight." Something went cold in her chest. Not fear. Something more specific than fear. "What kind of credentials?" she asked. "Federal, convincing ones. But they came through a civilian contractor channel that has no business being anywhere near a classified military transport case." She looked toward the elevator. "Which room?" she said. "Marsh." "Which room did they take him to?" Ray looked at her for a moment. 412, he said. She was already moving. She took the stairs. Not because the elevator was slower. It wasn't, not by much. But because the stairwell gave her 30 seconds of vertical space in which no one could see her face, and she needed those 30 seconds to do something she hadn't done in a long time, which was become someone other than Ellie Marsh. It wasn't a transformation. It wasn't dramatic. It was more like a volume adjustment, turning down the register she'd spent 4 years cultivating, the soft-spoken, eyes-down, don't-make-waves register of a woman who had decided that invisibility was a kind of safety, and turning up something underneath it that had never actually gone away. It had just been living quietly, the way certain things live quietly when you stop feeding them but can't bring yourself to let them die. She hit the 4th-floor landing and pushed through the door. The hallway outside room 412 was wrong before she could articulate why. She cataloged it the way she'd been trained to catalog environments: exits, sightlines, personnel, anomalies. 2 of Ray's plainclothes men were visible at the far end of the corridor, but they were positioned oddly, facing the wrong direction, partially blocked by the nurse's station. The night shift nurse who should have been at that station was standing in the doorway of the supply room across the hall with her arms crossed and her eyes pointed at the floor in the specific posture of someone who has been told, very recently, not to move. The door to room 412 was closed. It should not have been closed. Recovery room protocol on a high acuity patient meant the door stayed open or cracked. Anyone who'd worked a hospital for more than a week knew that. Ellie walked. She didn't run. Running draws attention, creates noise, announces arrival. She had learned the difference between the urgency that shows itself and the urgency that moves underneath the surface, quiet and fast, and very, very purposeful. She was 4 doors away when she heard it, a sound from inside 412 that didn't belong. Not loud. A scrape. The specific sound of something being moved that wasn't meant to be moved by the person moving it. She was 2 doors away when one of Ray's plainclothes men finally looked up and saw her and started to move in her direction with his hand raised in the universal gesture of "Stop right there." She was 1 door away when the door to 412 opened from the inside. The man who came out was wearing a white coat. He had a badge clipped to his pocket, the right color, the right shape, the right hospital logo, and he was carrying a tablet the way medical personnel carry tablets, tucked under the arm, screen down, the posture of someone who belongs and knows it. Everything about him was correct, which was exactly the problem. Ellie had spent 10 years in environments where the threat didn't announce itself, where the person carrying the weapon looked like the person carrying the supplies. She'd learned to read the difference not in what people showed, but in what they almost managed to hide. The slight wrongness in a posture, the micro-adjustment in trajectory when they registered unexpected variables. He registered her and adjusted his trajectory. It was a small adjustment, barely a degree, but it was away from the elevator and toward the stairwell door at the end of the hall, and it happened in the same half-second as his eyes completed their assessment of her. And Ellie had already committed to her decision before her conscious mind had fully caught up with what her body was doing. "Doctor..." She looked at his badge, made her voice professionally curious, the voice of a nurse with a question that needed answering. "I'm sorry, I don't think we've met. Are you covering the 412 consult?" He stopped. He had to. She'd positioned herself so that stopping was easier than continuing, placed herself in the pedestrian geometry of the corridor so that walking past her required a conscious choice to be rude rather than an accidental one. "Transferred up from 3, he said. His voice was level, practiced. "Covering for..." He named a doctor she'd never heard of, delivered smoothly, without hesitation. That was the second tell. Improvised cover stories were smooth. Real answers had friction, the half-second of accessing actual memory, the specific texture of someone recalling a name rather than producing one. "Of course," she smiled. "I just need to check his IV line before you go. His pressure's been uneven since the procedure. Can you give me 1 second?" She moved toward the door. He moved to intercept. Not aggressively. He was too trained for that. But he placed himself in her path with just enough intention to make it not quite accidental, and his right hand shifted toward his coat pocket. And in the coat pocket, she could see the slight rectangular weight of something that was not a phone and not a tablet stylus. Ellie had the crash cart handle in her right hand before he completed the motion. The crash cart was the one piece of equipment on any hospital floor that weighs enough to matter and is designed to move fast. She had positioned herself next to it when she'd stopped him. Not deliberately, or not entirely deliberately. Some part of her that cataloged rooms had noted its position and filed it. And she brought it sideways in a single controlled motion that hit him in the upper arm and shoulder and drove him hard into the wall. He was fast. He recovered faster than she'd expected, which told her something. But she was already in his space, left hand on his right wrist, using his own momentum and the leverage of the wall. And when he tried to use his left arm, she caught it at the elbow with a technique that had nothing to do with nursing school. He made a sound, pain, controlled, the sound of someone trained to absorb pain but not immune to it. And then the 2 plainclothes men from the end of the corridor were there, and it was finished, and Ellie stepped back and let them handle the geometry of restraint. Her breathing was even. Her hands were steady. She looked at her hands for a moment, the way you look at something that has just reminded you it remembers things you've been trying to forget. Then she looked at the door to room 412, pushed it open, and went in. The commander, Dax Heller, she had a name for him now, was awake. He shouldn't have been. The sedation protocols for post-tamponade recovery in a hospital like Hargrove ran standard, which meant he should have been somewhere between consciousness and not for at least another 2 hours. But he was awake, had clearly been awake for some time, and had also clearly been aware enough of his situation to have moved himself to the far side of the bed with his back against the wall and the IV pole in his left hand, in a grip that had more tactical intention in it than patient distress. He looked at her. He looked at the empty chair beside his bed, which had been moved, at the bedside table, which had been knocked slightly sideways, at the small spill of water on the floor that hadn't come from his water pitcher. Someone had been in this room. "How many?" she said. "One inside, one at the door, the one you handled." His voice was rough, and she could hear the effort it cost him to produce it. "There was a third one. He left about 5 minutes before you got here." "Which direction?" "Stairs. He made a call first." He looked at her steadily. "I couldn't hear the details." She went to the window. 4th floor, north-facing. The parking area was visible from here, partially. She could see 2 of the black military transports, could see Ray's people near the entrance, could see the organized way a controlled situation looks from above when the people managing it know what they're doing. She could also see a civilian sedan in the far corner of the lot that had not been there 30 minutes ago. Running plates wasn't something she could do from here, but she noted the color, the make, the parking position, close to the secondary exit, pointed out, the parking choice of someone who wanted to leave fast. "You shouldn't have moved," she said, turning back to Heller. "Your pressure is barely stable. If you'd pulled the IV, someone was trying to kill me." He said it the way people say things when they've made peace with the sentence. Flat, accurate, without drama. "I know." She crossed to the monitoring equipment, checked the numbers, adjusted the IV flow that had been partially kinked when he'd shifted position. Her hands moved through these tasks automatically. "Hold still." "You're the same person." "The IV got kinked when you moved. I need to." "Operator Phoenix, you're her." "I wasn't sure. I was told you'd been reassigned to civilian medicine, but the records were sealed and my CO couldn't get clearance to." "Hold still." She said it with enough quiet authority that he stopped talking, which told her that whatever Dax Heller was, he had the instinct to recognize a command even when it didn't arrive the way he expected commands to arrive. She fixed the IV. She checked the site. She read his monitors again and didn't like one of the numbers, but noted it and moved on. "You saved my life tonight," he said. "Twice, I think. The pericardiocentesis bought you time. The thoracic team will save your life. That's a different thing." "You know that's not what I mean." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the particular expression of someone who has been very close to dying recently and has not yet lost the clarity that produces, the way proximity to death strips the social padding from everything and leaves only the parts that matter. "I know what you mean," she said, "but I'm a nurse on duty in a recovery room. That's what I am right now." "That's not all you are." "It's all I need to be tonight." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear footsteps in the corridor, Ray's people, the sound of the situation being organized into something manageable. Inside the room, it was just the monitors and the controlled sound of a man breathing more carefully than he needed to because he'd learned, somewhere in the last hour, that his lungs would cooperate if he asked them to. "The man who called me in tonight," Heller said. "The one who knew I'd be coming through this facility. Someone in this hospital told them." He paused. "Not Ray's people. Someone already here." Something settled in Ellie's chest. Not surprise. Something worse than surprise. The specific weight of a thing you'd suspected being confirmed. "What makes you say that?" "Because the man who came into this room knew my room number before the duty nurse announced it. He came up through the east stairwell. He used a key card that should only work for medical staff." A pause. "And he asked me one question before he realized I wasn't sedated." "What question?" "He asked where the commander kept his mission files." He held her gaze. "He didn't know my name. He knew my rank and my room number, but he didn't know my name, which means whoever gave him the information didn't have access to my full intake record. They only had access to my transfer status and my room assignment." He paused. "Someone watching the operational end, not the medical end." Ellie thought about that. She thought about Raymond Stoll, who had been angry tonight in a way that had more edges in it than wounded ego. She thought about the way he'd looked at Ray, not with the discomfort of a civilian encountering military authority, but with something more specific, something she hadn't been able to name in the moment and was only now finding a word for. Fear. Raymond Stoll had been afraid, and the fear had come before Ray's arrival, not after. She filed it. She didn't speak it. Not yet. "Get some sleep," she said. "Ray's people are outside. The man in the corridor is handled. You're safe for tonight." "Are you staying?" She looked at the door. Through it, she could hear the corridor resolving into something quieter, personnel repositioning, the muffled exchange of procedural conversation, the sound of a situation being brought under control by people who were good at that. "I'll be nearby," she said. That was true enough. She had 6 hours left on her shift. She moved to leave. "Phoenix." She stopped. "He asked about the files," Heller said. "I don't keep mission files." But he didn't know that. Whoever told him I did, they have access to classified operational knowledge. He looked at her steadily. "That's not a contractor. That's not someone who bought information secondhand. That's someone who was inside at some point. Someone who knew how we operated." She looked at him for a long moment. "Get some sleep," she said again, and this time she left, and she pulled the door to room 412 shut behind her, and she stood in the corridor for exactly 3 seconds before her professional composure finished reassembling itself over the top of everything underneath it. Then she went back to work. The rest of that shift passed in the specific way that high-incident nights pass in hospitals. Not slow exactly, but with a quality of time that feels uneven, stretched in some places and compressed in others. The normal rhythms of the floor disrupted and not quite recovered. Ellie moved through it the way she moved through everything, doing what needed doing, being where she was needed, not drawing attention to the fact that she was running a parallel calculation in the back of her mind the entire time. She checked on 2 post-operative patients in the recovery wing. She updated charts. She had a brief, clipped conversation with Fortuna near the nurses' station at 2 in the morning, during which he looked at her with the same expression he'd had in the trauma bay and said, carefully, "That was, what you did in there. I've never seen anything like that." "It's a procedure," she said. "You'll learn it." "Not like that." He paused. "Are you okay?" The question caught her slightly off guard. Not because it was unexpected. Fortuna was, she had decided, someone who paid attention, but because she hadn't been asked that question in a meaningful way in a very long time. "I'm fine," she said. "Go check on the patient in 308. His fluid balance was off an hour ago." He went. She watched him go and felt something that she didn't have a clean word for, something in the neighborhood of gratitude, adjacent to loneliness, neither of them quite right. At 3:15, Raymond Stoll found her in the medication room. She heard him before she saw him. His footsteps had a particular quality, the footsteps of a man who had spent his career arriving in rooms with authority, and even tonight, in whatever state he was currently in, the habit was too deep to break entirely. But there was something off in the rhythm, a half-beat hesitation before he pushed the door. She didn't look up from the medication log. "Marsh." "Dr. Stoll." He came in and let the door close behind him. The medication room was small, shelves on 3 sides, a narrow counter, a single overhead light. There was nowhere to be in it except close together, and Ellie was aware of the geometry in the specific way she was always aware of geometry in enclosed spaces. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked up. His face was doing something complicated, the face of a man performing an action he doesn't have a well-worn groove for, in a moment he hadn't planned and couldn't fully control. Raymond Stoll's apologies, she suspected, were rare enough to be structurally awkward even when he meant them. "You don't have to—" "You were right," he said, "about the tamponade. You identified it before I did, and I dismissed it, and if you hadn't—" He stopped. Something moved in his jaw. "He would have died while I was arguing with you." She held his gaze. She said nothing. That's not something that I can just—" He stopped again. He was a man unaccustomed to sentences he couldn't finish. "I've been practicing for 20 years. I missed it." "It was a complex presentation," she said, because it was true. "Under different conditions. Don't." He said it quietly, not harshly. "Don't do that. Don't make it easier for me to feel better about it." Ellie looked at him. He looked back. For a moment, a strange, suspended moment, she saw something in his face that she had not looked for and had not expected, which was a person underneath the performance, a person who was tired and who had been frightened tonight in a way his professional identity didn't have a category for, and who was standing in a medication room at 3:15 in the morning because the alternative was going home and being alone with the version of himself that had told a nurse to go to Bay 3 and almost watched a man die because of it. "Who are you?" he said. "I mean, who were you before here?" The question sat between them. "A nurse," she said. "Marsh. I was a nurse before here too, different hospitals." She closed the medication log. "Is there anything else, Dr. Stoll?" He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were doing the thing eyes do when they're searching a face for information the face isn't offering. "The Admiral," he said. "He came here for you specifically. He came here for Commander Heller. He came here knowing you were here. That's not the same thing." She picked up the log and moved past him toward the door. Not rushing, not retreating, just finishing the conversation at the pace she'd decided it would finish. "Get some rest," she said. You have a 7 o'clock. She left him standing in the medication room. At 4:40 a.m., Ray found her in the break room. He came in alone, closed the door, and sat down across from her at the table with the specific economy of movement of someone who has been awake for a very long time and has learned to conserve everything. He set a file folder on the table between them, but didn't open it and didn't slide it toward her. "The 3 men have been taken into NCIS custody," he said. "The one in the corridor is talking. Not much, but enough to confirm they were operating under a private contract, targeting Commander Heller specifically. Because of whatever he knows. Because of what he was going to testify to. He's been called to provide operational testimony to a federal oversight committee. It's classified, but the people who wanted him silenced clearly weren't working from a position of ignorance." He paused. "The 3rd man, the one who left the room before you arrived. We have him on parking lot footage. Civilian vehicle. We're running it." "There's a sedan in the northwest corner of the lot," she said. "Dark blue, mid-size. It was positioned for fast exit." Ray looked at her. "I noticed it from Heller's window," she said, because that was true. And because the other part, the part where she'd cataloged it automatically, the way she cataloged everything, because that was something she apparently couldn't turn off, didn't need explaining. "We'll pull the footage." He was quiet for a moment. "The question of how they knew Heller's room assignment is still open." "It's not," she said. He waited. They had partial intake information. Room number, transfer status, nothing from his medical record. That means they accessed the system through an operational channel, not a medical one. Someone who processes transfer logistics, admissions, bed assignment coordination. Or someone with access to both systems. She thought about Raymond Stoll, about the fear on his face, about the way he'd moved in the trauma bay when Ray arrived. Not the confusion of a civilian encountering something unexpected, but the particular stillness of someone trying not to react to a specific thing. "I don't have evidence," she said. "Tell me anyway." She told him what she'd observed. She kept it precise, factual, stripped of interpretation. She described what she'd seen, not what she'd concluded, because she'd learned a long time ago that the distance between observation and conclusion was where innocent people got damaged by the machinery of investigation, and she wasn't willing to hand that machine an unsupported target. Ray listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "NCIS will interview all senior staff," he said. "That's already in motion. If there's something to find, they'll find it." He looked at her steadily. "You should know that Heller filed a formal request. Before the transport. He put it in writing." "What kind of request?" Ray opened the file folder. He turned it and slid it across the table. She looked at it. It was a formal military document, the kind that had specific formatting, specific language, specific boxes for signatures and clearance levels. Most of it was redacted. But the section visible at the bottom, the section with Commander Dax Heller's signature and a date 4 months in the past, was not. The request was for the reinstatement of review on a classified personnel record, her classified personnel record. She looked at the name at the top of the page, her real name, her full designation, and felt something move in her chest that wasn't quite what she'd been expecting, which was anger or defensiveness or the cold, controlled response of someone managing an intrusion. What she felt was something more complicated, something in the neighborhood of being seen. "He's been trying to reach you for months," Ray said. "Not for operational reasons. He wanted to tell you something." A pause. "I was on the team that recovered the survivors from Miran Province." The name sat in the air between them. Miran Province, the operation that didn't exist in any public record, the operation she had carried on her back for 4 years. In the small hours of every night, she lay awake in the apartment above the Port Salinger marina, in the specific weight of guilt that had followed her from a life she'd tried to leave behind. "I know," she said. "I was there." "You were there for the first part." He looked at her carefully. "You weren't there for what they found after." Her eyes came up. "He recovered documentation," Ray said. "On site. Classified until 3 months ago. The review board has been sitting on the declassification for—" He stopped. "The point is, the thing that happened. The part you've been carrying. Admiral. It wasn't your fault." 3 words. Delivered with the specific flatness of fact. Not comfort, not performance, not the softened language of someone trying to make her feel better. Just a factual statement by a man who had read the declassified documentation and was reporting its contents. Ellie sat with it. She had a lot of practice sitting with difficult things. She had learned to sit with them without letting them show on her face, without letting them move through her too fast, without letting the feeling of them land before she was ready. She sat with this one and it didn't do what she'd expected. She'd expected something like relief. What she got instead was something older. The feeling of a structure you've been leaning against for a long time suddenly not being there anymore, and having to figure out how to stand on your own. She looked down at the document. She looked at her own name. "He could have called," she said. "Your file was sealed. He couldn't reach you through official channels. He was trying to find a way to reach you through—" Ray stopped. Something shifted in his expression. The smallest thing, a compression around the eyes. "He nearly died tonight before he could tell you himself." She looked at the document for another moment. Then she closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. "I need to finish my shift," she said. "Marsh." "I need to finish my shift," she said again. The same register, the same level voice. But something underneath it was different. Some specific quality of the flatness had changed, altered by the thing that had just been placed in the room and couldn't be taken back out. She stood. "The NCIS interviews," she said. "I'm available whenever they need me." "I know." She moved toward the door. "Ellie." She stopped. The name, her first name, the one she'd been going by, the civilian name she'd wrapped around herself like a coat 4 years ago. Coming from him sounded strange. Not unpleasant, just strange. Like hearing a translation of something. "He's gonna be okay," Ray said. "Heller. The thoracic team got him at 5 after midnight. He's out of surgery. He's stable." She nodded. She put her hand on the door handle. "One more thing," Ray said. "The man from the corridor, the one you subdued." She turned her head slightly. "He had a military background, specific background. The technique you used to control his arm." Ray paused. He recognized it. He told the NCIS agent who processed him that he'd seen it once before, years ago. He looked at her steadily. He said it was a Phoenix-grade technique. The break room was quiet. "He said only one person ever moved like that," Ray said. "He said he'd been briefed on her, back when he was still working legitimate contracts. He said she was supposed to be retired." Ellie looked at the wall beside the door. "He's wrong," she said. "I'm just a nurse." She opened the door. The corridor outside was pale with the particular light of early morning hospital, fluorescent and flat, the light of a shift preparing to end and another preparing to begin. The sound of the building coming back to itself after a hard night, people moving, monitors beeping, the thousand small sounds of a place that does not stop because something significant has happened in it. She stepped into it. She had 40 minutes left on her shift, and she intended to spend them doing exactly what her job required, because that was the structure she had built for herself, and right now, it was the only one she trusted to hold. She was 3 steps down the corridor when her pager went off. She looked at it. The number was the trauma bay, not a routine call. The code that preceded the number was the one that meant immediate, critical, all hands. She had memorized the hospital's paging codes in her first week because she memorized everything, and this one she had hoped, on some level, she would never have to respond to again tonight. She broke into a run. Whatever had been waiting to find her, whatever the morning had been building toward while she'd spent the last hours sitting in break rooms and standing in corridors and holding herself very carefully together, it had apparently decided not to wait until her shift ended. The trauma bay doors swung open ahead of her, and even before she was through them, she could hear Raymond Stoll's voice, not the controlled authority of a man managing a situation, but the voice of someone who has just discovered that the situation is larger than what he'd prepared for, saying a name. Not hers. A name she didn't recognize. And then, through the open doors, she saw the person on the gurney. And every calculation she had been running quietly in the background of this night stopped simultaneously, replaced by a single recognition that had nothing professional in it, nothing measured, nothing controlled. She knew this man. Not from Hargrove. Not from Port Salinger. From before. From a time and a place and a version of herself that she had been very carefully not thinking about for 4 years. And he was not moving. His name was Marcus Vell. She had not seen him in 4 years, 2 months, and some number of days she had stopped counting because counting it had become a thing she did at 3 in the morning instead of sleeping, and she had made a decision, at some point, to stop doing things that kept her from sleeping. Marcus Vell. Sergeant First Class. Retired. Combat medic. Same program as her. Different cohort. Different deployment track, until Miran Province had put them in the same compound for 11 days that had compressed themselves into a weight she still carried in her sternum when the weather changed. He was unconscious on the gurney, GSW to the left shoulder. She could see that immediately. The dressing applied at the scene was soaked through and the angle of penetration visible in the way he was holding even in unconsciousness, the body instinctively protecting the injury site. His color was wrong. Not gray, not that far yet, but pale in the specific way that blood loss looks different from pallor, the skin pulling back from something it can't afford to spare. She was at the gurney before Stoll had finished directing the intake team. Marsh, Stoll started. What's his pressure? The paramedic on the left, young, running on adrenaline, competent, didn't hesitate. 86/50 on scene, dropped to 79 en route. I was conscious until about 4 minutes out. Pulse ox? 91. When did he lose consciousness? 3-4 minutes before arrival. He was responsive but confused. He asked. The paramedic paused. He asked for someone named Phoenix, twice. The trauma bay went briefly strange. Not quiet. There was too much happening for quiet. But strange in the way of a room where multiple people have simultaneously registered something and are collectively not looking at each other. Ellie's hands were already on Marcus's neck, checking the carotid quality, assessing the JVD, running the fast physical inventory that her nervous system conducted before her thoughts had organized themselves into words. No tamponade. The pulse was weak but palpable at the carotid. Neck veins were flat, which meant the volume loss was hemorrhagic, not compressive. Left shoulder wound was the primary bleed source, but the pressure drop was too significant for that wound alone, which meant secondary hemorrhage somewhere, abdominal, thoracic, she couldn't tell yet, or a vascular injury the field dressing hadn't found. I need a fast exam now, she said. Not to anyone specific, to the room. Stoll stepped in beside her. He didn't argue. That was new, and she registered it the way she registered everything, filed, noted, not processed yet. Ultrasound's coming, he said. You know him. He was in my unit, years ago. Stoll looked at her for 1 second, reading whatever he could read in her face, and then made a decision she respected. He stopped looking and started working. Get me 2 large bore IVs, he said to the room. Type and cross stat. I want 4 units ready. And get radiology on the line. We're not waiting for a scheduled slot. The trauma team moved. Ellie moved with them. The ultrasound showed free fluid in the abdomen, not a small amount. The fast exam, rapid, bedside, exactly what it was designed for, showed fluid in Morrison's pouch and around the spleen that shouldn't have been there, that had been accumulating since whatever had happened to Marcus Vell before anyone got to him. Splenic laceration, probably. Maybe hepatic. The shoulder wound was almost a distraction, a real injury, a real bleed, but not the thing that was going to kill him. The thing that was going to kill him was the bleed nobody had found at the scene because it was internal and quiet and had been doing its work steadily for the last however many minutes since he'd been shot. He needs the OR, Ellie said. I know. Stoll was reading the ultrasound images, his face doing the thing it did when he was calculating. Rowan's on call. He did the thoracic case tonight. He's had maybe 2 hours. He needs someone now. I know, Marsh. He said it without sharpness. Get me Dr. Rowan on the line and get surgical prep started. If his pressure holds for 20 minutes, we do this right. If it doesn't, he looked at her. We improvise. She picked up the phone. While she made the call, one part of her brain maintained the parallel thread she'd been running since she'd walked through the trauma bay doors. The part that was watching Marcus Vell's face, tracking the micro changes in his color and his breathing and the subtle tension of his unconscious musculature, reading him the way she had learned to read patients in environments where the monitoring equipment was either unreliable or absent. He was holding, barely. She got Rowan on the line. I was awake. She could tell by the quality of the silence before he spoke, the focused silence of someone who had not actually been asleep. Abdominal hemorrhage, possible splenic lac, hemorrhagic shock, GSW to the left shoulder as primary visible injury, she said. He's 51 years old, male, currently unconscious, BP 79/50, and dropping. We need the OR. Rowan asked 3 questions. She answered all 3. He said he'd be there in 12 minutes. She put the phone down. Marcus's eyelids moved. She was at his side. Hey! Her voice shifted registers automatically, the sharp clinical mode dialing back to something lower, more direct. Human. Marcus, if you can hear me, squeeze my hand. His fingers tightened around hers. Not strong. The grip of a man running on reserves, but present. You're at Hargrove Naval Medical Center, she said. I'm here. You're going to surgery. I need you to hold on for 12 minutes. His lips moved. She leaned closer. Found you, he said. The words came out in pieces, breath working hard around them. They said you were... I had to... Don't talk, save it. Moran... A pause. A breath. Not your fault. It was never... I have the... He stopped. His grip tightened. File. I have the file. The real one. Not what they put in the record. The actual... Marcus. In my jacket. His eyes were trying to open and not quite managing. Inside pocket. Left side. Don't let them take it. She looked up. His jacket, tactical, civilian, cut away by the paramedics at the scene, was in the evidence bag hanging from the gurney rail. She looked at it. She looked back at Marcus. Got it, she said. I've got it. Stop talking. His fingers loosened, not releasing. Just the grip of a man who had delivered what he'd come to deliver and was allowing himself to let some of the effort go. Stoll appeared at her shoulder. Pressure's at 74. I know. He's not going to last 12 minutes at this rate. I know. She pulled her hand free from Marcus's gently. She moved to the supply cart. Her mind was running the calculation, or versus intervention now, and the variables in that calculation were narrow and none of them were good. If we go in here, we're doing it with a trauma bay setup, Stoll said. He was not talking her out of it. He was, she realized, asking for confirmation. No general anesthesia, no perfusionist on standby. He's crashing. I know. If we wait for Rowan, we might not have him to operate on. Stoll looked at her. Then he looked at Marcus Vell on the gurney. Then he looked at the monitors, and the numbers, and the specific arithmetic of a situation that had no clean options. What do you need? He said. She told him. What followed was not the version of surgery that happened in controlled environments with optimal lighting and the full complement of available resources. It was the other version, the kind that happened in the field, in forward operating bases, in improvised aid stations in buildings that had been something else before they were needed to be this. The version that required you to be fast and accurate and willing to tolerate imperfect conditions without letting the imperfection become the thing you were focused on. Ellie had done this before. Not in a trauma bay, technically. In places with less equipment and more chaos and stakes that had existed at a scale that a hospital administrator would not have been able to conceptualize. But the physical process, the hands-on management of a body that was losing the argument against its own injuries, that was something she knew at a level below thought. Stoll was good. She'd known he was good because incompetent surgeons didn't last at naval medical centers, regardless of how well they managed institutional politics. But watching him work at close range, in conditions that stripped away all the ceremony of a proper surgical suite, she understood that he was better than she'd given him credit for. Precise and fast in the way that only came from having done this specific thing many times under pressure that was real rather than simulated. They worked. She tracked the pressure numbers and relayed them. She managed the suction. She anticipated the next step in the procedure and had the right instrument ready before he asked for it, which required knowing what the next step was. which required a level of surgical knowledge that no nursing program had given her. She could feel Stoll registering this, not in words or glances, but in the rhythm of the work itself, the way a person's movements change when they realize they're working with someone who knows what they're doing. Marcus's pressure stabilized at 81. Not good, but stable. Stable was the difference between a man who lived and a man who didn't. Rowan arrived at the 9-minute mark, scrubbed and ready, took one look at the situation, and stepped in where he was needed without being briefed on everything first, because he was the kind of surgeon who read rooms fast. He took over the primary from Stoll. Stoll stepped back and let him. Ellie maintained position because Rowan glanced at her once and didn't tell her to leave. 22 minutes after Marcus Vell had come through the trauma bay doors, his pressure was at 94/60 and rising. He was not out of danger. He was going to the surgical suite for full repair, and the shoulder wound needed proper attention, and the next 48 hours were going to be the real test. But he was alive, and he was in the hands of people who were going to keep him that way, and that was what the moment required. Rowan looked at Ellie over his mask as the transport team moved Marcus toward the elevator. "Good call on the intervention," he said. "Another 5 minutes, and—" "I know," she said. He nodded. He followed the gurney. The trauma bay was quieter. The particular quiet that settled after a crisis had been managed. Not resolved, not over, but moved from acute to ongoing, from emergency to process. Ellie stripped off her gloves. She walked to the gurney rail where the evidence bag was hanging and unclipped it. Stoll was behind her. She heard him not speaking, which was a thing she had become aware of over the last hour. Raymond Stoll had a presence even in silence, and the quality of his silence right now was not the silence of someone who was going to say nothing. Nothing. Marsh. "He asked me to hold it," she said. "He said not to let them take it. That bag is incident property. If NCIS—" "I'm aware." She opened the bag. The jacket was inside, dark fabric, cut in 2 places by paramedic scissors, the left side still mostly intact. She found the inner pocket. The zipper was stiff. She worked it open and reached inside. Her fingers found a folded envelope, thick with what felt like multiple pages, sealed with a strip of evidence tape that had not come from any hospital. Someone had sealed this before Marcus came through the door. He had known he might not be able to tell her himself. She looked at the envelope. Her name was on it, not the name on her hospital badge. Her full name. The one in the sealed file. The one that connected the person she was now to the person she had been. She put it in her scrubs pocket. "I'll give it to Ray," she said. "It's related to the Heller case." Stoll looked at her for a moment. "Is it?" "Yes." She wasn't entirely sure that was true, but she was sure of this. Whatever was in that envelope, it needed to be in the hands of someone she trusted before it ended up in a chain of custody that she couldn't track. She left the trauma bay. The hospital was in the particular state of early morning that felt different from middle of the night, brighter somehow, even under the same fluorescent lights, moving toward the shift change that would bring fresh personnel and the daylight bureaucracy of administrative medicine. Ellie walked through it with the envelope in her pocket and the weight of the last 6 hours sitting in her body in the way exhaustion sits when it hasn't been allowed to land yet. She found Ray in the small conference room off the main corridor, where he'd apparently established a temporary operational post. There were 2 laptops on the table, a secure phone unit, one of his plainclothes men at the door, and a coffee that looked untouched. He looked at her when she came in. He looked at the envelope when she set it on the table. "Marcus Vell," she said, "former SFC, combat medic, same operational program. He was brought in 40 minutes ago, GSW, abdominal hemorrhage. He's in surgery." Ray's expression changed. "Vell. I know that name. He was in Mairan province. He told me he has documentation, the real after-action record, not the one in the official file." She paused. "Someone shot him tonight. Someone who didn't want this envelope to get where it was going." Ray looked at the envelope without touching it. "Where was he found?" "I don't have that yet. The paramedics brought him in. I'll get the incident report." "I'll get it." He said it with the flat efficiency of someone for whom getting things was not complicated. He looked up at her. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." "You've been on shift for—" "I'm fine." She said it the same way she'd said everything tonight. Level, controlled, the surface giving nothing away. but she could feel the envelope's absence from her pocket, like a phantom weight, and she could feel the specific exhaustion that came from a night that had been too large for the container she'd been trying to keep it in. "The document," she said. "Whatever's in it." Heller mentioned an oversight committee testimony. "If the documentation is what Marcus said it is, it changes the scope of the investigation," Ray said, "significantly. And it gives whoever sent those 3 men a very clear motive for everything that happened tonight." Ray looked at her steadily. "Not just tonight." She waited. "The sedan from the parking lot," he said. "We got the plate. It's registered to a shell company that traces back—" He paused. "It traces back to a set of contractors that have been operating under federal cover for the last 6 years. We've had peripheral visibility on them for 18 months. They've been flagged in connection with witness interference in 2 other oversight cases." He set down his pen. "This isn't a rogue operation. This is organized, coordinated. Someone with significant resources has been moving against anyone who could provide direct testimony to the committee." Which means Heller wasn't the only target. No. Marcus was bringing documentation. He was a target too. Yes. Who else, She stopped. Ray's expression told her the answer before he said it. "There's a third witness," he said. "Someone whose name is in the classified operational record. Someone who was present for the events in Miran province." He looked at her. "Someone whose current location has been sealed for 4 years." The break room coffee machine hummed from down the corridor. Somewhere above them, in the surgical suite, a man named Marcus Vell was being kept alive by people who were doing their best with the tools they had. And in the conference room off the main corridor of Hargrove Naval Medical Center, Ellie Marsh understood, with the specific clarity of someone who has just watched a pattern complete itself, that she had not accidentally ended up in the middle of this night. She had been in the middle of it for 4 years. She just hadn't known it was circling back. "They know I'm here," she said. Ray didn't answer, which was an answer. "How long?" she said. "We believe the location compromise happened within the last 72 hours. Which means whoever accessed it did so recently, specifically, not a passive data breach." She thought about Raymond Stoll, about the fear in his face before Ray had arrived, about the specific quality of that fear, not the fear of someone confronted with authority, but the fear of someone whose private actions were suddenly visible in a room full of people. Someone who had access to hospital systems and military transfer records, someone who could cross-reference both. "NCIS is moving on it," Ray said. "They've been moving on it since 4 a.m. Who's their primary person of interest?" Ray looked at her for a moment. His expression had a quality of reluctance in it, not dishonesty, but the reluctance of someone who is deciding how much to say and has landed on saying all of it. "Dr. Raymond Stoll," he said. The name sat in the air. Ellie thought about the medication room, about Stoll's apology, which had seemed genuine, about the way he'd worked tonight in the trauma bay, the decision he'd made to step in and help rather than fight her, the strange, stripped-down quality of a man who had been frightened into something more honest than his usual performance. She thought about the fear. "He has a gambling debt," Ray said. "Significant. We've been tracking the financial connections. It took a few hours to pull the threads. The contractors offered him money in exchange for information. Operational intelligence he could access through the hospital's combined military-civilian interface." He paused. "We believe his first contact with them predates Commander Heller's arrival. He's been feeding information for approximately 3 months. Ellie sat with that number. 3 months ago, she had been a quiet nurse in a Port City hospital, invisible and unremarkable, the woman nobody asked questions about. 3 months ago, Raymond Stoll had been approached by people who needed access to a system that could cross-reference military transfer records with current hospital assignments. 3 months ago, someone had been looking for her. "The apology," she said. "I'm sorry?" "Tonight, he came to me with an apology. Around 3 a.m. She paused. "I thought it was guilt about missing the tamponade, but that's not what it was." Ray watched her. "He was scared," she said, "not because of what he'd missed clinically, because Ray's people were in the building and whatever arrangement he'd made was about to become visible." She stopped. "He didn't know if I knew. He came to take the temperature." "That's consistent with what we're seeing." She stood up from the chair she'd taken at some point without noticing. She moved to the window. Outside, the parking lot was lighter than it had been, pre-dawn gray. the sky doing the thing it did an hour before actual sunrise, the world becoming visible before it was quite light enough to see clearly. "Does he know you're looking at him?" she said. "Not yet. We want to give him enough rope. He's going to run." She turned around. "If he has any operational sense from whoever he's been working with, and he suspects his name is in play, he's going to try to disappear before the shift change when NCIS can move officially." She looked at Ray. "What time is it?" 5:20. "Shift change is at 7. His 7 o'clock. He mentioned it. He'll want to be somewhere that looks normal before then." She thought fast. "He might already be moving." Ray was on the secure phone before she'd finished the sentence. She watched him talk, quick, precise, the clipped language of someone passing operational information through a channel that both parties understood. And she thought about Raymond Stoll moving through this hospital right now, or not moving, or standing somewhere calculating his options the way frightened people calculated options when the walls had started to close. Ray ended the call. "He's in the building," he said. "Scanned his badge at the East Wing Records Room 6 minutes ago." Records room. "He's trying to access something." She was already moving. The East Wing Records Room was 3 minutes from the conference room at a walk. At the speed Ellie was moving, it was 90 seconds. She went through the corridor and around the administrative wing corner and through the door to the east hallway, with Ray's plainclothesman 2 steps behind her and Ray himself speaking into his phone as he kept pace, and she could already see from 20 feet away that the records room door was open. Ajar, not properly open. The specific position of a door opened in a hurry by someone who hadn't wanted to stay long. She pushed through. The records room was empty. Not recently vacated, immediately vacated. The terminal on the left-hand station was still showing an active session, the screen not yet locked, the access log visible. She looked at it. The last query was a personnel file lookup. Her personnel file. Not the sealed military one. The hospital one. 4 years of shifts, assignments, performance reviews, incident reports. The file that showed, if you looked at it with the right knowledge, exactly who Ellie Marsh was and how she operated and what she was capable of, and the note Raymond Stoll had added to her disciplinary record 6 months ago. The one that had cited her for insubordination during a resuscitation. The one that was false. The one that, read in isolation without context, made her look unstable. She understood what he'd been doing. If things went wrong, if the operation came apart and his name surfaced, he needed a version of events where the nurse who had been present was unreliable, where her testimony could be questioned, where the documented record said she was the kind of person whose account of events might not be credible. He had been building an exit strategy for months. She heard footsteps in the corridor, fast ones. The footsteps of someone who had been in this room and had not gone far, and had heard, or seen, that the room was no longer empty. She stepped back from the terminal. "He's still on this floor," she said. The plainclothes man was already on his radio. And then, from somewhere above them, from the floor above, through the ceiling, the sound traveling down through the building's bones, she heard something that stopped all of them. A door. Then an alarm. Not a medical alarm. Not a code. The building's fire egress alarm. The one connected to the stairwell doors, triggered by a door being opened from the inside with enough force to engage the sensor. The east stairwell. She was running before the plainclothes man had finished his radio call, and she hit the stairwell door at full speed, and she took the stairs upward because the east stairwell connected to the roof access, and the roof access connected to the service bridge that ran between the main building and the parking structure. She came through the roof access door into cold early morning air and low gray light, and the sound of wind off the harbor carrying the smell of salt water. The service bridge was 40 feet ahead of her. Raymond Stoll was on it. I was moving fast. Not running, but the fast walk of a man who had decided that running would look like running, and fast walking still had a story to tell. And he was 20 feet onto the bridge when he heard her come through the door and turned. He looked at her. She looked at him. 40 feet between them. The service bridge was metal grating, open to the air on both sides, running between the hospital building and the concrete parking structure. Below it, 4 stories down, the service road. "Raymond," she said. Her voice carried across the wind. He looked at her with the face of a man who had spent the last hour making decisions he couldn't take back and had arrived, finally, at the one he liked least. "I need you to come back inside," she said. "I can't." He said it plainly. No performance in it, just a fact. You don't understand what these people, if they think they don't leave witnesses, Marsh. You of all people should understand what that, I understand it. She took a step forward. But running puts you in a worse position, not a better one. You're a material witness in a federal case. If you run, you become a fugitive. If you come back inside, you become an asset. I'm already a dead man. You're not. She kept her voice even. Ray's people can protect you. NCIS can protect you. But only if you're in custody, not on a roof. He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved between them. The things I wrote about you, he said. The disciplinary notes. I need you to know, I know. I need you to know I knew they were false when I wrote them. I know that too. He looked down at the bridge grating, then up at the sky, pale gray and lightning, the harbor visible in the distance, the slow brightening of a morning that had not been earned so much as survived. I didn't know they were going to send people to kill anyone, he said. That's not... I want you to know that wasn't what I thought I was doing. I thought it was information, just information. That's what they always say, she said. Come back inside. He was still for a long moment. Then he took a step back toward her. And then the shot came. Not loud, suppressed, the specific flat crack of a weapon with a noise reduction device. And it came from the parking structure on the far side of the bridge. And it did not hit Raymond Stoll. It hit the bridge railing 18 inches from his left hand, and the spark of impact lit for a half second against the gray morning, and Stoll stumbled backward with the shock of it, and Ellie was already running toward him across the grating because the next shot would correct, and the next shot would not miss, and the person on the far end of that rifle was not trying to scare anyone. She hit Stoll low and drove him sideways behind the steel support column on the near side of the bridge as the second shot crossed the space where he'd been standing. She was on the ground, one arm over him, her shoulder against the column, and she could feel him shaking, not the controlled shake of someone managing fear, but the full-body tremor of a man whose body had just understood, viscerally and without argument, that someone was trying to end him. Stay behind the column, she said. There's someone... I know. She looked up. The parking structure was 80 feet away, elevated, multiple levels. The angle of the shots had come from the third or fourth level. She was narrowing it from the trajectory, from the positions of the two impacts. Don't move. Above her, she could hear Ray's plainclothes man on the roof shouting into his radio. Below, the building alarm was still sounding, and on the third level of the parking structure, in the growing light of a morning that was finally, reluctantly arriving, someone was repositioning, coming for a better angle. Ellie looked at the distance between the column and the roof access door. She looked at Stoll. She looked at the parking structure. She calculated. The distance from the column to the roof access door was 22 feet. She had measured it instinctively when she'd come through, not consciously, not deliberately, but the way she measured every space she moved through, the way the part of her brain that had never agreed to retire filed dimensions and angles and sight lines without being asked. 22 feet of open grating with no cover. The shooter on the third level of the parking structure had a clean angle on that gap. Not perfect. The early light was against him, the gray morning flattening depth perception, and the support columns broke the line of sight in two places. But good enough. A trained shooter with a suppressed rifle at 80 feet did not need perfect conditions. Ellie looked at Stoll. His face was gray-white, the specific color of a man whose body had just received information that his mind hadn't finished processing. His breathing was fast and shallow, not injured, just shock. The physical response to nearly dying that the body produced whether the person wanted it to or not. Listen to me, she said. When I move, you move. You stay directly behind me and you don't stop regardless of what you hear. You get through that door and you get flat on the floor and you stay there. You're going to... Don't ask, just be ready. She looked at the parking structure. Third level, north face. She had narrowed it from the two shot angles. They'd come from slightly different positions, which meant the shooter had moved between shots, which meant he was operating alone and without a spotter, which meant he was making his own corrections, and those corrections took time. She needed to create a problem that required correction. She took the metal water bottle from Stoll's coat pocket. He'd been carrying it. She'd felt it when she'd driven him to the ground. She turned it in her hand, gauged its weight. When I throw this, she said, you go. Don't wait for me. Don't look back. Get through the door. What are you... Stoll. She looked at him directly. I have done this before. Go when I throw it. He looked at her. Whatever he saw in her face settled something in him because he stopped asking. She counted her breath. Then she threw the water bottle hard and low, across the grating, away from the door, sending it clanging and spinning toward the far side of the bridge. A moving sound source, a shape in the peripheral sightline of a man looking through a scope trying to track targets in flat early morning light. She went. She went fast and low, stole directly behind her. She could hear him, the heavy footfall of a man running on terror rather than training. And she was 15 feet to the door, and then 10. And then she heard the shot, the flat suppressed crack, and the round hit the grating to her right and threw a spark. And then she hit the door and drove it open, and they were through, and she went sideways and down and pulled Stoll with her, because coming through a door upright, when someone has your angle, was the last mistake a lot of people made. The door swung shut. They were on the roof access landing. Stoll hit the floor and stayed there, breathing in the ragged, uncollected way of someone who had not been in a situation like this before and had no vocabulary for what his body was doing. Ray's man was 3 feet away, pressed against the wall, already on his radio. Shooter on level 3, north face, parking structure, suppressed rifle, requesting immediate. Ellie wasn't listening to the rest. She was counting. The shooter had fired twice in this sequence. He'd fired twice in the previous sequence. 4 shots total, 2 positions, consistent spacing. He was disciplined, which meant trained, which meant he had a protocol, and protocols had architecture, and architecture had predictable elements. He would move again after the miss, change position, new angle assessment, reacquire. That took time. She looked at Ray's man. Where are your people in the structure? 2 on level 1, 1 at the entrance. Level 3 north is where the shots came from. Get someone moving now, before he relocates. The man looked at her for half a second, the look of someone evaluating whether the person giving instructions had the standing to give them, and then made a decision and relayed it into his radio. She looked at Stoll. He was sitting up against the wall, back straight, hands on his knees. He was doing something with his breathing, deliberate, controlled, working to slow it down through effort of will. She recognized the effort. She'd made it herself in different rooms. "You're okay," she said. "Someone just shot at me." "I know. You're okay." She paused. "You're going to be okay." He looked at her. His eyes had something in them that she hadn't expected, which was a species of clarity. The clarity that sometimes arrived in people after the thing they'd been most afraid of had actually happened and had not killed them. "I'll cooperate," he said. "I want you to know that. Whatever NCIS needs. Whatever they need me to say." "I know. I should have..." He stopped, started again. "I was in over my head from the first conversation. I knew that. I kept thinking I could manage it, and it kept getting larger, and I didn't know how to... There wasn't a door out of it." "There is now," she said. He looked at her steadily. "There is now," she said again. "But you have to walk through it yourself." He nodded, once. The nod of a man who understood the terms and had accepted them. But they brought the shooter down from level 3 of the parking structure at 6:11 a.m. Ray's people, supplemented by the military police unit that had been on standby since midnight, took him in the stairwell between levels 3 and 2. He'd been relocating exactly as she'd predicted, and they'd cut the angle. He was armed with a suppressed rifle and a sidearm, and was carrying identification that identified him as a federal contractor with a clearance level that had been revoked 8 months ago by an agency that would spend the next several days being very interested in how he'd continued operating under it. He didn't say anything when they took him down. Didn't fight, didn't negotiate, didn't produce the cover story that men like him usually had ready. Just went quiet and still and compliant in the way of someone who has run the remaining options and found them all closed. Ellie was not there for the takedown. She was back inside the building because she was still on shift, technically, and because the thing that needed doing was not on a parking structure stairwell. She went back to the trauma bay. The overnight team was cycling out, the faces changing, the fresh shift personnel arriving with their coffee and their pre-shift briefings, absorbing the information about the night with varying degrees of reaction. Ellie moved through the handoff process on autopilot, relaying patient status information to the incoming nurse with the flat precision of someone whose professional machinery was still running even when the person inside it was running low. Fortuna found her at the charting station. He looked like he'd been awake for 20 hours, which was accurate, and he had the specific expression of someone who had processed a great deal in a short time and was still working on the last several items. Marcus Vell is out of surgery, he said. Rowan says he's stable. ICU for observation, but the prognosis is good. Something in her chest loosened. Not much. Enough. Good, she said. Heller's pressure has been stable since 3 a.m. They're talking about moving him to a step-down unit by this afternoon. Good. He looked at her for a moment. Is everything? I'm fine, Fortuna. You look like you haven't slept in 30 hours. 22. She looked up from the chart. And neither have you, so we're even. He almost smiled. The Admiral's people are in the conference room. I think they want to talk to you again. I know. She finished the note she was writing and closed the chart. She stood up. Her body informed her, in the specific language of accumulated hours, that it had carried a significant amount tonight and would prefer acknowledgement of this fact. She noted it and moved on. What happens now? Fortuna said. She considered the question, not the surface version, the procedural answer about NCIS interviews and federal cases and medical license reviews. The question underneath it, the one he was actually asking, which was something more like, what does this mean? All of it. What does it mean when a night like this one ends and the building is still standing and the people who are supposed to be safe are mostly still alive? The people who need to answer for things will answer for them, she said. And the people who needed to survive will probably survive. And tomorrow there'll be another shift. He looked at her. That's very practical, he said. That's medicine, she said. She walked toward the conference room. What? The NCIS interview lasted 90 minutes. The lead agent was a woman named Petra Solis. Compact, direct, the kind of precise that came from years of working cases that required precision rather than force. She asked good questions, and she listened to the answers rather than waiting for them to end, which Ellie respected enough to answer with equal precision. She told Solis everything. She did not editorialize. She did not protect anyone. She described what she'd seen and what she'd done and what she'd concluded and the specific basis for each conclusion, and she described Raymond Stoll's behavior over the course of the night in the same terms, factual, sourced in observation, stripped of the personal weight that the night had given it. Solis took notes and didn't interrupt and asked follow-up questions that demonstrated she understood the operational context she was working in. When it was done, she closed her notebook. One more thing, she said, the disciplinary notes in your personnel file, the ones Dr. Stoll added. I know about them. We've already flagged them for review. Given his admission that they were false, which he made to 2 of our agents approximately 40 minutes ago, they'll be formally expunged. She paused. I want you to know the record will be clean. Ellie looked at the table. She thought about 4 years of carefully maintained invisibility, of absorbing contempt she hadn't earned and couldn't fight without drawing the attention she'd been avoiding. She thought about the specific quality of being dismissed in a room full of people, the way it accumulated, the weight of it, the way it changed the way you held yourself and moved through spaces and answered questions. She thought about the fact that a false disciplinary note in a personnel file was, in the scale of everything that had happened tonight, not the largest thing. But she thought about it. Thank you, she said. Solis nodded and stood. At the door, she turned back. I read part of your file, she said, the parts that became declassified 3 months ago. She held Ellie's gaze. What you did in Meran province, what you carried afterward. A pause. I wanted you to know that someone read it and understood what it cost. She left. Ellie sat with that for a moment. Then she got up and went to find Ray. I was in the corridor outside Heller's room. Step-down unit, 1 floor up from the recovery wing, the quieter end of the building where the critical cases went to become serious but stable cases on their way to becoming recoverable ones. He was on his phone when she found him, and he finished the call and pocketed the device with the same economy he brought to everything. Stoll is in federal custody, he said. He's cooperating. The financial trail he's giving us goes further than we expected. There's a network of contractors who've been running information operations for 18 months, targeting multiple witnesses in the oversight case. Stoll was one of several access points. How many witnesses are compromised? We're working that number, at minimum 4. He paused. The committee has been notified. The testimony is being moved to a secure location with full protective protocols. Heller will testify from here, remotely, once he's medically cleared. And Marcus? Vell's documentation is in the hands of the committee's lead counsel as of 40 minutes ago. It arrived via secure courier. Apparently, Vell had a secondary copy held by a lawyer with instructions to release it upon his hospitalization. He looked at her. He planned for the possibility that he wouldn't be able to deliver it himself. She thought about Marcus, 4 months ago, preparing for a contingency he hoped he wouldn't need, filing the backup with the lawyer, and then getting on a plane or in a car and driving to Port Salinger and getting shot for his trouble. "He's a thorough man," she said. "He is." Ray paused. The documentation corroborates what the committee has been building toward for 18 months. The Miran province operation, the classified elements. They're being reviewed as part of a broader inquiry into decision-making at the command level. The record that was filed officially was altered. Marcus Vell has the original. He let that sit for a moment. The altered record placed operational responsibility for the civilian casualties on field-level personnel, on the medics and the operators who were on the ground. He looked at her carefully. The original record makes it clear the decision was made 3 levels above the field. The people on the ground, including you, were following orders that were later disowned. The corridor was quiet. She had known something like this was true, had known it in the way you know things you've never been able to prove, the knowledge that lives in the body rather than the mind, the conviction you can't source but can't abandon. Hearing it said plainly, sourced in documentation, was different. It was the difference between carrying a weight and being told the weight was never yours to carry. She did not cry. She was not, in general, someone who cried in institutional corridors in front of flag officers. But she felt something move through her, a slow release of something that had been held for a long time, and she stood in the corridor and let it move and did not perform anything in either direction. Ray gave her the moment without filling it. "The formal review will take time," he said, when she was ready. "Months, probably. The documentation will be verified, the command-level accountability will be established through proper channels. It won't be fast." "It doesn't need to be fast," she said. "It needs to be right." He nodded. From inside the room, she could see through the narrow window in the door. Dax Heller was awake, sitting partially upright, the hospital bed adjusted, looking at something in his hand that appeared to be a photograph. He had the specific quality of a man who had come very close to a thing and survived it, and was in the early stages of understanding what survival meant for the next part of his life. "He wants to see you," Ray said. "I know." She didn't move immediately. She stood at the door for a moment and thought about the version of herself that had walked into Hargrove Naval Medical Center 4 years ago. The version that had decided smallness was safety, that invisibility was a reasonable substitute for peace, that the best way to carry what Miran province had left her was to carry it alone and quietly and forever. She thought about how long she'd been wrong. Then she pushed the door open and went in. Heller put the photograph down when she entered. She didn't look at it. It was his, and whatever it was wasn't hers to know unless he chose to tell her. "You're supposed to be sleeping," she said. "I slept for 3 hours." He shifted slightly, and she could see the effort it cost him, the shoulder wound and the post-surgical soreness combining into the specific misery of a body in the early stages of recovery. "That's more than you've had." "I'm fine." "You keep saying that." "It keeps being true." She checked his monitors. His pressure was stable, his rhythm was good, his color had come back from the gray-white of last night to something closer to his actual complexion, which was the color of a man who spent significant time outdoors. "How's your pain?" "Managed. Scale of 1 to 10. 5. He paused. "Maybe 6. I'll have someone adjust your drip." "In a minute." He looked at her steadily. "I need to say something first." She waited. "I've been trying to reach you for 4 months, he said. "I knew Vell had the documentation. I knew what was in it. I needed you to know. I needed someone to tell you in person, not in a file, not in a formal review, that what happened, what you've been carrying—" He stopped. "You saved my life in Miran province. You made the call that got 4 of my people out alive, and it cost you everything afterward, because the report that came back said you'd made the wrong call. And that report was a lie told by people who needed someone to blame and chose the person who couldn't fight back." She looked at him. "You deserve to hear that from someone who was there," he said. "Not from a document. From a person." The room was quiet except for the monitors. "Marcus said something similar," she said. "On the gurney. Marcus has been saying it for 4 years. He's been trying to find you for almost as long as I have. He looked at her steadily. We weren't going to let it stay buried, whatever it cost. She thought about the cost. Marcus in a surgical suite 2 floors down, held together by Rowan's skill and the blood bank's resources. Heller himself, 24 hours ago running an operational mission, now in a hospital bed with a chest drain and a recovering shoulder. People she hadn't asked to carry anything for her. People who had done it anyway. You're both idiots, she said. Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. Probably, he said. She adjusted his pillow, not because it needed adjusting, but because her hands needed something to do, while the rest of her processed the weight of what the last 8 hours had deposited. He let her do it without comment, which told her something about Dax Heller's particular kind of intelligence. What happens to Stoll? He said, after a moment. He's cooperating with NCIS. If he follows through, he'll likely face federal charges for the information trafficking, reduced based on the cooperation. His medical license, she paused. That'll be a separate review board. But given what he admitted to, the outcome isn't in question. And the contractors. Multiple arrests. The network goes deeper than last night. NCIS has been building toward this for 18 months. Last night gave them enough to move. She straightened. The people at the command level, the Myron province decisions, that's the Oversight Committee's jurisdiction. It's going to take time. But it's moving. It's moving. He was quiet for a moment. And you? She looked at the window. Outside, Port Salinger was doing what it did in the early morning, the harbor visible from this floor, the water catching the first real light of the day, the specific silver gray that preceded full sunrise. It was going to be clear. She could tell from the quality of the light, the absence of the heavy coastal cloud that sometimes settled on the city for days at a time. I'm going home, she said. I'm going to sleep for approximately 8 hours, and then I'm going to come back here and do my job. Is that enough for you? She looked at him. I don't know yet, she said honestly. He nodded. Fair answer. She moved toward the door. Phoenix, his voice behind her. She stopped. Ray mentioned something about a program, a training position. He paused. He said you hadn't given him an answer yet. I haven't. Would you... He stopped. Chose his words. Is it something you'd consider? She looked at the door in front of her, at the narrow window and the corridor beyond it, and the building visible through the corridor windows in the distance, the parking structure, the service bridge, the ordinary geography of a place where nothing should have happened, and several things had. Ask me when you're recovered, she said. She pushed through the door. The formal NCIS action against Raymond Stoll moved faster than she'd expected. By 9 a.m., 2 hours after Ellie had finally gone home, slept for 6 hours out of the 8 she'd promised herself, and come back because she couldn't stay away. The official process had already produced its first visible result. Stoll's hospital access credentials had been suspended pending investigation, which meant his badge no longer opened doors, which meant the building had quietly reorganized itself around his absence in the way institutions do when a senior figure is removed abruptly. A controlled rearrangement, everyone calibrating to the new configuration without quite saying out loud what it meant. She heard about it from Fortuna, who had also gone home and also come back. The department head just called a briefing, he said. Administrative leave pending investigation. They're bringing in Dr. Varela from the main surgical unit to cover his cases. Good. There's going to be a full review of his case history, all the incident reports he filed, everything he signed. He paused. There are a lot of people who had notes added to their files. She had thought about that, about the specific power of a position like Stoll's, the ability to write the record, to shape the documented version of events, to use the legitimacy of institutional authority to damage people who couldn't effectively fight back. She had been one of them. She was probably not the only one. Make sure you document everything you witnessed, she told Fortuna. Whatever NCIS asks for, don't protect anyone and don't minimize anything. Including the things I witnessed about you? How he treated you? She looked at him. Especially those. The record needs to be complete. He nodded, serious. She left him at the nurse's station and went to check on her patients. The ordinary ones, the non-critical ones. The people in this building whose crises were personal and medical rather than operational, who needed medication reviewed and wounds checked. and the kind of steady, present attention that nursing required regardless of what was happening in the building around them. She did this for 2 hours. She was in the middle of changing a dressing on a patient in room 318, a merchant marine officer named Dalton with a post-surgical wound that was healing well but needed careful monitoring when her pager went off. The number was the administrative wing. She finished the dressing. She told Dalton his wound looked good and his discharge was probably 2 days out. She stripped her gloves and washed her hands and walked to the administrative wing. The hospital director's office was at the end of the administrative corridor, a room she had been in twice in 4 years, both times for routine credentialing reviews, neither time for anything that mattered. The director was a man named Harold Price, civilian, former Navy himself, who ran Hargrove with the particular combination of administrative efficiency and institutional loyalty that naval medical centers required. He was standing when she came in, which was not what she'd expected. Ray was there. Solis was there. And beside Price's desk, in the particular stance of someone who is present in a professional capacity but feels the weight of the moment personally, stood the hospital's chief of nursing, a woman named Geraldine Vaughn, whom Ellie had interacted with approximately 6 times in 4 years. "Nurse Marsh," Price said, "please sit down." She sat. "I'll be direct," he said, because he was that kind of man. The events of last night and the investigation that has followed have brought to light a significant number of procedural failures and individual misconduct issues within this institution. We are cooperating fully with NCIS and Naval Special Warfare Command. He paused. We are also conducting an internal review of specific personnel actions, particularly those involving your personnel file. Agent Solis mentioned the disciplinary notes, she said. The notes are one element. We've identified 7 incident reports over 4 years that appear to contain inaccurate characterizations of your professional conduct. All 7 were filed by Dr. Stoll. He looked at her steadily. They will be expunged, formally and completely. The expungement will be documented in your file with a notation explaining the basis. She nodded. Beyond that, he glanced at Vaughn. We are aware that your assignment history within this institution reflects a pattern of deliberate underutilization. You were consistently assigned below your demonstrated skill level, removed from high acuity cases, and excluded from advancement opportunities that your performance record would otherwise have supported. I didn't pursue advancement, she said. I understand that. But the record shows a pattern of active discouragement rather than neutral administrative decision-making. He paused. We intend to correct that pattern, in practical terms. She waited. There is a position, Vaughn said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was direct, the voice of someone who had thought about what they were going to say. Lead clinical coordinator for the trauma unit. It was posted 6 months ago and... She paused. It was not presented to you at the time. That was an oversight that I take personal responsibility for. I want to be clear about that. Ellie looked at her. The position is being reoffered, Vaughn said, if you want it. The room was quiet. She thought about the civilian version of a life she'd been building for 4 years. The invisible nurse in the corner, the woman who absorbed contempt and kept her hands steady and told herself that smallness was a reasonable way to live. She thought about how long she'd believed it, how long she'd needed to believe it. She thought about Marcus in a surgical suite, about Heller in his room with a photograph, about the specific things Solis had said in the conference room. Someone read it and understood what it cost. I'll think about it, she said. Price nodded. He looked like he'd expected that answer, which made her think he was paying attention. There's one more thing, Ray said. Everyone in the room looked at him. He produced a document from the folder he'd been holding. He set it on the desk in front of her. She looked at it. It was her declassified military record. Not a summary. Not the edited version. The full record, or as full as the declassification allowed, with the classified portions still redacted but the relevant sections. The sections about Miran province, about the field decisions made there, about the after-action assessment, visible and legible in bearing, at the bottom the formal notation of the review board's corrected findings. She read the relevant section. The language was bureaucratic, which was the only language official records spoke. But the substance was clear. The field-level personnel present in Miran province had acted within the scope of their orders and their training. The outcome had resulted from command-level decisions that had been made above their clearance and without their knowledge. The original after-action report had been altered to redirect accountability. and at the bottom, in the specific formal language of institutional correction. The record is altered, is hereby rescinded. The following notation supersedes all prior documentation. Below that, in smaller type, a list of names, field personnel, the people who had been in that compound. Her name was on it, her real name, her full designation, Operator Phoenix, performance, exemplary, conduct, commended. She set the document down. She looked at the desk for a moment, the surface of it, the ordinary grain of a wooden desk in an administrative office in a hospital building in a port city on a clear morning. She had not cried in the corridor outside Heller's room. She was not, as noted, someone who cried in institutional spaces. But she sat with this for a moment and let it be what it was, which was not a conclusion, which was not an ending, which was the specific thing that came when a very long wrong was named correctly for the first time, and the naming was irreversible, and the world on the other side of it was not the same shape as the world before. She picked up the document. She looked at Ray. "The training program," she said. "Yes." "Tell me more about it." Something shifted in Ray's expression. Not surprise, not triumph, just something that looked like a man who had been holding a door open for a very long time, finally seeing someone walk through it. He began to tell her. She listened, and outside the window, Port Salinger was fully awake now, the harbor catching the clear morning light, the water moving the way it always moved. Indifferent, continuous, carrying everything forward whether the things being carried were ready or not. She was listening. And in the corridor outside the administrative wing, where the shift had fully changed and the day was properly underway, a young resident named Fortuna was telling a colleague something he'd witnessed the night before, speaking carefully, searching for words that were equal to the thing he'd seen, finding that the right words weren't available and using the best ones he had. And the colleague was listening with the expression of someone trying to understand something they hadn't been there for. None of them knew yet that in the records room on the East Wing, in the secondary backup of the hospital's administrative system, the one that NCIS hadn't fully processed, there was a file that Stoll had opened and not closed, and inside that file was a communication he hadn't sent. And inside that communication was a name that none of them had yet spoken out loud. A name that connected the contractor operation not to Stoll. Stoll had been a door, not an architect, but to the person who had designed it. A person who was not in custody. A person who, as of 6:40 a.m., had left the building. Solis found the file at 7:14 a.m. Not by accident, she had been working through the secondary backup system for 40 minutes, methodical and unhurried in the way of someone who trusted process over speed, who had learned that cases broke on patience more often than on urgency. The NCIS forensic team had flagged the unsent communication in Stoll's session log, and Solis had pulled it herself rather than delegating, because she had a sense about this case, had developed it over the course of the night, that the important things needed her eyes directly. The unsent communication was addressed to a name. She ran the name. It took 4 minutes for the query to return results, which told her the name was not in the primary civilian database. It was in a secondary one, the contractor registry that NCIS maintained in parallel with the Department of Defense's own records, the registry of people who had operated under federal cover and whose status had changed. The name was Garrett Muse. Garrett Muse, former defense intelligence analyst, former contractor liaison, former employee of 3 shell companies that had been operating under federal cover for the past 6 years, and whose financial records had been flagged 18 months ago in connection with the same oversight investigation that was currently consuming 3 federal agencies and 1 congressional committee. Garrett Muse, who had been issued a hospital visitor credential under a different name 11 days ago, who had last badged into Hargrove Naval Medical Center at 6:22 a.m. that morning, who had badged out at 6:40. Solis was on the phone before she finished reading. Ellie was still in Price's office when her pager went off again. She looked at it. The number was unfamiliar, a direct line, not an internal code. She excused herself and stepped into the corridor and called it back. Solis answered on the first ring. The contractor operation had an architect, Solis said. Not Stoll. Stoll was an access point. The person who designed the network, who recruited Stoll, who directed the 3 men sent to the hospital, who coordinated the shooter in the parking structure. His name is Garrett Muse. He was in this building until approximately 40 minutes ago. Something went cold and precise in Ellie's chest. He knows the operation is blown, Solis continued. He'll be moving. We have his vehicle description, civilian SUV, gray, registered under a shell company, and we've issued to local law enforcement. But he has a 40-minute lead, which means he won't go to the highway, Ellie said. Solis paused. What makes you say that? Because if he knows the operation is blown, he knows the obvious exits are covered. He's not stupid. You don't build an 18-month network by being stupid. She thought fast, the way she thought in rooms where the options were narrowing and the wrong choice had permanent consequences. He needs a position, not an escape. He needs something he can use. A bargaining piece. What kind of bargaining piece does he have left? Ellie thought about the building, about who was in it, about what the night had left unresolved and what it had made visible. Marcus, she said. Vel. He's the only one who had physical documentation. Muse knows that. If he accessed Stoll's files, he knows everything Stoll knew about the situation here. He knows Marcus came in last night. He knows Marcus survived. ICU is on the 3rd floor. Yes. A beat. I'm 2 minutes out, Solis said. Don't. I'm already moving, Ellie said, and ended the call. She took the stairs because the elevator had a wait, and because she had learned, at some point in a life that had required repeated learning of this lesson. The 2 minutes was a long time when the outcome depended on the gap between arrival times. 3rd floor. ICU. The duty nurse at the station, a man named Reeves, whom she knew slightly, solid and experienced, looked up when she came through the stairwell door, moving at a speed that was not normal. Vel in 304, she said. Has anyone gone in since the shift change? Reeves looked at his log. Surgeon checked in at 7, vitals team at 7:10. He paused. Visitor credential 718. Man said he was family, I think. I checked the credential. It cleared. What did he look like? Reeves described him. Mid-50s, civilian clothing, calm, the bearing of someone who moved through institutional spaces without friction. The credential had been legitimate, or legitimate-looking, which in a hospital at shift change, when the desk was processing multiple arrivals, amounted to the same thing in practice. Call security, Ellie said. Now, and stay at the desk. She moved down the corridor. Room 304 was 4 doors down. The door was closed. ICU protocol kept them closed, which meant she couldn't see through the window from the angle she was approaching. She slowed as she reached the door, pressing flat to the wall beside the frame, the old instinct arriving without being summoned, the body remembering what the mind preferred to forget. She listened. One voice. Low, controlled. The voice of someone speaking to a person who was only partially conscious, which Marcus was. ICU sedation levels keeping him at the shallow end of sleep, recoverable but not fully present. She went through the door. Garrett Muse was standing at the left side of Marcus's bed. He was not holding a weapon. He was holding Marcus's wrist, not clinically, not with any medical purpose, in the specific grip of someone communicating a point through physical contact rather than words. He looked up when she came in. He was exactly what Reeves had described. Mid-50s, unremarkable in the way of someone who had cultivated unremarkability. The face of a man who had spent a career in rooms where being the most visible person was a liability. His eyes, though, his eyes had a quality of rapid assessment that no amount of practiced ordinariness could fully conceal. He looked at her. She looked at him. Nurse Marsh, he said. He said it the way people said things when they were buying seconds. Let go of his wrist, she said. I'm visiting a friend. Let go of his wrist and step away from the bed. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man running options. She had seen that expression before. She had learned to recognize the specific transition when the options ran out and the person arrived at the only remaining calculation, which was whether the person in front of them was a real obstacle or a manageable one. She let him see that she was not a manageable one. He released Marcus's wrist. He did not step away from the bed. He moved sideways, toward the window, away from the door, which put him behind Marcus and narrowed the angles. It was a tactical repositioning and it was instinctive, the movement of someone trained to control space. You're not going to get out of this building, she said. NCIS is 2 minutes away. The exits are being covered. Whatever you're planning, talking to him, threatening him, taking something from him, it doesn't change what's already been sent to the committee. The documentation can be contested. It's already been verified. Something flickered in his expression. Not panic, he was too controlled for panic, but the micro-adjustment of someone receiving information that closes a door they'd been keeping open. "The network you built," she said. "The contractors. Stoll. The men you sent here last night. All of it is in federal hands. Stoll is cooperating. The shooter from the parking structure is in custody. The financial trail is being followed right now by people who are good at following financial trails." She held his gaze. "It's done." "You're a nurse," he said. "Yes." "You have no authority here." "I have the authority to stand between you and a man in a hospital bed who almost died last night because of decisions you made." She took one step forward. Not aggressive, deliberate. The step of someone who has decided where they stand and is comfortable with it. "And I have the authority to keep standing here until the people with badges arrive." He looked at her. She looked back. The monitor beside Marcus's bed beeped steadily. Marcus himself was not unconscious. She could see his eyelids moving, the shallow quickening of his breathing that indicated awareness without full emergence. He could hear this. He could not help, but he could hear. "Walk to the door," she said. Hands visible. Muse looked at the window. Fourth floor of the parking structure. She'd thought about him being there, hadn't known his name yet. Planned exits, controlled positions. A man who thought in contingencies. There were no contingencies left. He walked to the door. Solace was in the corridor when it opened. She had made her 2 minutes, or just under, and 2 NCIS agents flanked her, and the geometry of the doorway left Garrett Muse exactly no version of what came next that didn't involve custody. He did not resist. He had the bearing of a man who had decided, in the last 30 seconds, that dignity and defeat was the only card he had left to play. They took him into the corridor. Solis looked at Ellie over his shoulder as they moved him. "Good call," she said. Ellie looked at Marcus through the door. His eyes were open. Not fully, the sedation was still working, the recovery still in its early hours, but open enough to find her, to hold focus on her face with the deliberate effort of someone working against the weight of medication and pain and exhaustion. She went back in. She sat down in the chair beside his bed, the chair Muse had not been using, the chair for people who were there because they wanted to be, rather than because they had an agenda. "He's gone," she said. "It's done." Marcus's hand moved. Not much, a slow shift across the blanket. She put her hand over it. "Heard," he said. One word, pulled from somewhere effortful. "You did good," she said. "The documentation, the lawyer, all of it." His fingers tightened slightly against hers. "Told you," he said, barely audible. "Not your fault." She sat with that. Outside the room, the corridor was moving through its morning, staff changing, equipment rolling, the ordinary machinery of a hospital in full daylight operation. The sounds of a place doing what it was built to do, absorbing the extraordinary and continuing. "Sleep," she said. He closed his eyes. She stayed until his breathing evened and deepened into genuine rest. Then she stood up, and she walked out, and she stood in the corridor for a moment and felt the full weight of the nightland on her all at once. Not dramatically, not with any single overwhelming emotion, but the way accumulated weight lands when you finally stop moving and the structure that was holding it upright lets go. She stood with it. Then she went back to work. The formal hospital staff briefing happened at 11 a.m. Price convened it in the main conference room, the large one, not the administrative one, and the room filled with the day shift and the remnants of the night shift and the attending physicians and the nursing staff and the residents and the administrative personnel, everyone who worked in the building and had come in that morning to find it changed from what it had been the day before. Price spoke for 12 minutes. He was precise and unsparing. He described what had occurred, what had been discovered, what actions were being taken. He named the investigation without naming its classified components. He described Stoll's suspension and the ongoing NCIS inquiry without editorializing. He described the circumstances of multiple patient safety events during the night and the clinical responses that had managed them. He did not describe Ellie Marsh by name. He described a nurse on the trauma team whose clinical judgment had prevented a patient death, whose actions during a security incident had protected both a patient and a colleague, and whose conduct throughout the night had represented the standard Hargrove Naval Medical Center was built to meet. He said it plainly, without performance, and then he said, "I'd like to ask that nurse to stand." The room was very quiet. Ellie was in the third row. She had not expected this. She had in fact occupied the third row specifically because it was not the front, was not visible from all angles, was the row of someone who was present but not the center. She stood. The room looked at her. She had spent 4 years learning to sustain that kind of attention, with her face composed and her eyes neutral, and every external signal communicating that there was nothing of particular interest to see. She did the same now. But underneath it, underneath the composure that had become so automatic she barely felt herself producing it anymore, something was different. She was not performing invisibility. She was just standing. The applause started somewhere to her left. She thought it was Fortuna, but she wasn't sure. And it moved through the room in the way that things move through rooms when they've been waiting for a reason, when the room itself has been holding something that needed releasing. Not everyone applauded immediately. Some people hesitated. Some of the physicians, some of the senior nursing staff who had worked under Stoll long enough to absorb his assessments of the people around him. But it spread, and it held. And by the time it reached its full weight, it was the sound of a room that had recalibrated something fundamental about what it understood. She stood in it and let it be what it was. She did not cry. She almost did. There was a moment, somewhere in the middle of it, when the accumulated cost of 4 years collided with the accumulated cost of one night, and the sum of those things pressed against something in her chest that was not as controlled as the rest of her. She held it. Not because showing it would have been wrong, but because this particular moment required her to be fully present in it rather than inside it, and the distinction mattered to her. When the applause ended, she sat down. Price continued with the briefing. She looked at her hands in her lap, the hands that had done what they'd done, that remembered things the rest of her had tried to leave behind, that had refused, apparently, to fully comply with the version of herself she'd been trying to build. She had never quite made peace with those hands. She was beginning to think that was the wrong project. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon that was cold and clear, with the specific clarity of a November coastal day, Ellie Marsh sat across a table from Rear Admiral Thomas Ray in a conference room at Naval Special Warfare Command in Norfolk, Virginia, and signed her name to a document. Not her hospital name, her full name, her actual designation, the name that connected the person she was to the person she had been, drawn together into a single continuous line rather than the 2 separate lives she had spent 4 years pretending were not the same person. The document established her formal role as founding clinical director of the Joint Operational Medicine Training Initiative, a program that would train the next generation of military combat medics in the specific disciplines that had historically been developed only through operational experience and its attendant costs. The program would run out of Hargrove Naval Medical Center with a satellite component at the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility in Virginia Beach. She had negotiated the Hargrove component herself. She had not wanted to leave the hospital. She had realized, somewhere in the weeks following that night, that the hospital was not where she had been hiding. Or not only that, it was also where she had been practicing, where her hands had stayed sharp, where a version of herself had been maintained quietly and imperfectly and under conditions she hadn't chosen that could still do the things that needed doing when the night required it. She signed the document. Ray countersigned it. He looked at her across the table with the expression she had come to recognize on him, which was not warmth exactly, but something that functioned like it in the vocabulary of men who dealt primarily in operational facts. "Welcome back," he said. "I didn't go anywhere," she said. He almost smiled. The federal charges against Garrett Muse were filed 6 weeks after his arrest. 12 counts. Conspiracy to obstruct federal proceedings. Witness intimidation. Contracting with unlicensed operatives in connection with federal investigations. Conspiracy to commit murder. The last one carrying mandatory minimums that made the others almost redundant. His network of shell companies was dismantled in parallel by a financial crimes unit that had been building the case for 18 months and finally had the predicate they needed to move. He entered a not guilty plea at his arraignment. The trial date was set for 14 months out. Federal cases moved at their own pace, and Ellie had stopped expecting speed from institutions that ran on deliberation. What she expected was accuracy, and the evidence that Solis's team had assembled, combined with Marcus Vell's documentation and Stoll's full cooperation and the financial records that the forensic accountants had spent 6 weeks unraveling, was accurate in a way that left very little room for alternative interpretation. Raymond Stoll pled guilty to 4 federal counts. The sentencing guidelines, adjusted for cooperation, produced a result that was neither lenient nor theatrical: 3 years federal supervision, significant financial penalties, and the permanent revocation of his medical license by the state board, which conducted its own review and reached its own conclusions on an accelerated timeline given the circumstances. His name was removed from the hospital's board of department heads, from the conference room plaques, from the endowed surgical chair that bore his name in the main surgical suite. Removed quietly, without ceremony, the way institutions removed things they had decided to stop endorsing. Ellie was not present for any of it. She heard about it the way she heard about institutional consequences, through Fortuna, who kept her informed with the specific thoroughness of someone who understood that she needed to know without needing to perform anything about it, and who had developed, over the months since that night, into one of the better emergency physicians she had worked alongside. She told him so once on a Thursday afternoon when the shift had been long and neither of them had eaten enough. He looked at her with the expression he'd had in the trauma bay the first night, the expression of someone who has seen something that exceeds their available vocabulary, and said, "I learned it from watching you." She looked at him for a moment. "You learned it from doing the work," she said. "I just didn't get out of your way fast enough." He laughed. An actual laugh, tired and genuine. It was the kind of sound a place needed, and Hargrove had been producing more of it since the night it had been forced to confront what it had been and choose what it was going to be instead. Marcus Vell was discharged from Hargrove Naval Medical Center 41 days after his admission. He walked out on his own, slowly, with a cane he was going to need for another few weeks, and had already decided he resented, but on his own. Ellie was at the entrance. She had not coordinated this. She had simply been finishing a shift that ended at 3 p.m., and his discharge was at 3 p.m., and it had not seemed necessary to pretend that the timing was coincidental. He looked at her. She looked at him. He had always looked like someone who was prepared for difficult things. It was something in his posture, the way he held himself upright without it being a performance, the quality of a man who had absorbed hard knowledge and incorporated it rather than fighting it. He looked like that now. More so, maybe, with the cane and the careful movement and the specific quality of someone still in the early stages of understanding what their body had been through. "You didn't have to wait," he said. "I was finishing a shift." "Uh-huh." She held the door. He came through it, and they stood in the pale winter light outside the main entrance for a moment. The harbor visible down the hill, the water gray-blue and cold, the ordinary afternoon geography of a city that had no idea what had happened inside that building 2 months ago. "Ray told me about the program," he said. "He talks too much. He's excited about it, in whatever way Ray is capable of excitement." He looked at the water. "Are you?" She thought about it honestly, the way she'd been trying to think about things since that night, without the automatic deflection she'd been using for 4 years, without the practice minimization that had become so habitual she'd stopped noticing it. "Yes," she said. "Good." He said it simply, without sentiment, the word of someone who meant it and didn't need it decorated. They stood there for another moment. "Moran Province," she said. "What I've been carrying." "Yeah." "It's not gone." She looked at the water. "I don't think it becomes gone. I think it just stops being the thing that makes all the decisions." He was quiet for a moment. "When did that happen?" She thought about the night, about the needle in the pericardial space and the hands that held steady, about the corridor and the crashed cart and the bridge in the early morning, about Marcus on a gurney saying, "Not your fault," with the last breath he could spare. "I think it's happening," she said, slowly. He nodded. That was enough. She had come to appreciate the kind of honesty that didn't require resolution to be valid, the kind that named something still in process without pretending it was finished, without the false comfort of a clean ending imposed on something that was still working itself out. She was not finished. She was not broken. She was somewhere between the two, which was, she had come to understand, where most people actually lived, not in the before or the after, but in the long middle of becoming whatever the difficult things were making them. "You need a ride?" she said. "Ray sent a car." "Of course he did." Marcus looked at her. A small smile crossed his face, the first real one she'd seen from him, unhurried, the smile of someone who had enough distance from the worst of it to find something almost funny. "Thank you," he said. For what? For being here, he said, both times. She looked at him. She thought about saying something deflecting, something about professional obligation, about being on shift, about the coincidence of timing. She thought about all the ways she had learned over years to redirect gratitude before it could land fully. She let it land. You're welcome, she said. He walked toward the car. She watched him go. Dax Heller testified to the Federal Oversight Committee via secure video link from his hospital room on the 31st day of his recovery. The testimony lasted 4 hours and covered operational decision-making at the command level in connection with the Mehran Province incident, the subsequent alteration of field records, and the coordinated effort to prevent that alteration from becoming known to the committee. She did not watch the testimony. She was on shift. She heard about it that evening from Ray, who called her with the specific economy of a man delivering a summary he had prepared. The testimony had been received, the committee would conduct its review, the command-level personnel whose decisions were implicated had been placed on administrative suspension pending the outcome, and the process, slow, deliberate, structured, was moving forward. It's going to take time, he said. I know. But it's moving. I know, she said again. She was sitting in her apartment above the Port Salinger Marina when the call came. The window faced the water, the harbor dark now, the lights of the channel markers blinking in their patient sequence, the water doing what it always did regardless of what was happening on the land around it. She sat for a while after the call ended. She thought about the version of herself who had walked into Hargrove 4 years ago, who had chosen this city specifically because nobody she knew was here, who had chosen this apartment specifically because the water was visible from the window, and looking at water had always made the weight easier to carry, who had built a small, careful life around the principle that invisibility was protection and silence was survival. That version of herself had kept her alive. She was grateful to her. She was also done being her, not because the caution had been wrong. It hadn't been, not entirely, not given what she'd known at the time, but because what she'd learned in that long, strange night was that the skills she'd been trying to contain and the life she was trying to build were not actually in conflict. The hands that held a needle steady in a crashing chest and the hands that changed a dressing and checked a fluid balance were the same hands. The person who had walked across a service bridge toward a shooter's position and the person who had sat with a frightened 23-year-old sailor and talked him through his fear of being hurt, the same person. She had spent 4 years trying to be only one of them. It had not worked. She looked at the water. Tomorrow she had a meeting with the first cohort of medic trainees assigned to the new program. 12 people, various backgrounds, various levels of operational experience, chosen specifically because they were good enough to build on and still early enough in their careers to be shaped by what the program could give them. She had spent a week on the curriculum. She had opinions about the curriculum, strong ones. She had communicated those opinions to Ray with the specificity of someone who had spent years watching what the existing training missed and knew exactly which gaps cost lives. He had, to his credit, listened. She stood up from the window. She went to the kitchen, found something reasonable in the refrigerator, ate it standing at the counter without making it into an event. She was tired in the good way, the tired of a day that had been full rather than just long. The kind of tired you earned. She thought about Fortuna, who was taking the lead on a research paper about emergency pericardiocentesis in austere environments. He had asked her to co-author it. She had said she would think about it, and had been thinking about it, and had arrived, somewhere in the last few days, at yes. She thought about Marcus, healing in a rehabilitation facility 2 cities north. He had applied to serve as a guest instructor in the training program. Ray had approved it without asking her, which she had opinions about, but the approval itself she did not argue with. She thought about Dax Heller, who would be discharged in another week and had already sent her a message, formal, brief, the message of a military officer operating within the vocabulary his training had given him, that said simply, I plan to be there when the program launches, if you'll have me. She had written back, you're not a medic. He had written, no, but I was there, and I want to see what comes from what you build. She looked at that message for a moment. Then she wrote, then come. She rinsed her plate. She went to bed. She slept without the particular weight that had been living in her chest for 4 years. Not because it was gone, because it was not entirely gone, because things like that rarely were. but because it had shifted. Because the distinction between carrying something and being carried by it had finally, and with considerable effort and cost and the specific help of people who had refused to let the story stay buried, become clear. In the morning, she would go back to the hospital. She would walk into the trauma unit, not as the nurse nobody asked questions about, not as the woman in the corner keeping herself small, but as the person she actually was. Imperfect, complicated, carrying more history than anyone around her knew, capable of more than most of them had been allowed to see. She would do her job. And in the doing of it, she would teach the people who came after her what she knew, not only the technical knowledge, the procedural knowledge, the knowledge that lived in her hands, but the harder knowledge, the knowledge she had paid for in years she couldn't get back. That the quiet one is not always the weak one. That the person they dismiss is not always the one worth dismissing. That the difference between the person who survives and the person who doesn't is sometimes skill, sometimes circumstance, and sometimes simply this: that someone refused to be as small as the room told them to be. She had taken a long time to refuse. She was refusing now. That was enough. That was in the end exactly enough.